My name is Seth Hays. I am Managing Director of APAC GATES, which is a Taipei-based association and nonprofit management consultancy. Today, we're really pleased to launch the report, Bridging Commerce and Rights Advocacy, which we did with the great support of the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law in Washington, D.C. Today, we will share the findings of the paper. My colleague Morgan Hughes, Managing Director of Research at APAC GATES, will share the findings of the paper. We'll also have, immediately after me, a few words from Julie Hunter from the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. She's the Senior Legal Advisor for Asia and Pacific. She'll share a little bit about this project's umbrella and a little bit about the ICNL. Following that, we will have a case study from our colleagues at the Malaysian AmCham. We wanted to have the Chief Executive Officer, Siobhan Das Bakran, share her experience of her organization throughout the pandemic and how they pivoted more into the public interest. Finally, we'll have a short discussion, panel discussion with representatives from international business associations, civil society specialists, and those with experience in government affairs from the corporate side. So we will have the CEO for Labor Solutions, Ms. Elena Fanjul Debnam. We'll have the chair of the AmChams of Asia Pacific, AAP, Mr. Steve Oken. And we'll have Mr. Sean Shea, founder and director of Social Innovations Advisory, and also a civil society entrepreneur here in Taipei, as well as a longtime consultant for the ICNL. So without further ado, Julie, we'd love to hear from you.
Great. Thank you, Seth, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here with you all, and thank you all very much for coming. Seth said, my name is Julie Hunter. I work at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law based in D.C. For those who don't know us, ICNL is an international nonprofit organization that focuses on promoting enabling legal frameworks for civil society and protecting civic freedoms, including the freedom of association, assembly, and expression. So we're very much grateful to be here today, to APAC GATES as the organizers, to my fellow panelists, and looking forward to the discussion. And I just wanted to provide a minute or so of framing around this report and research and some of the other work that ICNL and other partners have been doing around civic freedoms, pandemic and emergency governance, with a look towards the future and where we're sort of taking these findings moving forward. So this project was born from a call for proposals looking at best practices employed by both governments and other actors, including civil society, to protect civic freedoms during times of emergency. And we began this project because it was part of a larger program that was looking and tracking a lot of the negative restrictions, a lot of different laws and policies that impacted civic space, that restricted civic freedoms in a way that, based on international standards, was not balanced with the different public health objectives. So ICNL was tracking this information in most countries in the world, and we had a big research and tracking project in Asia as well. And in more restrictive regimes, we saw a lot of not great practices in terms of all sorts of rights and kind of overbroad restrictions, security-driven measures, sometimes sort of not very well hidden agendas that impacted human rights under the guise of emergency measures. So at the same time, we were noting that there were much better practices and some best practices employed globally, but in Asia as well. And we commissioned a series of papers, one of which Sean worked on better practices in the region from Taiwan, from South Korea, New Zealand, Japan, looking at examples of collaborative governance, working with civil society, specific government policies to protect civic freedoms. That's the report there. And then we also received this proposal from APAC GATES looking at the roles of chambers of commerce and other international business associations. And we found it to be quite intriguing because I don't think there's been as much research done on the roles of IBAs and chambers of commerce. We find them to be an interesting form in the sector. They're nonprofits, but they include private entities and business associations and other nonprofits. They have sort of a unique positioning with respect to their host governments, and they may have more leverage and avenues for entry than domestic civil society in some situations. So we were quite interested to see the findings of the report. And I believe that it is very interesting, and that there's a lot of food for thought and, things to think about for how we can bridge different areas of civil society and different types of rights advocacy moving forward. So, so with that, I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and your feedback, and I'll turn it back to Seth. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Julie. What we will do is we will pivot over to the report itself. So I will hand it over to my colleague, Morgan, who will run through the findings of the report plus the recommendations of the report. So she will be able to share her screen here in just a second. Make sure you unmute first here. There we go.
You might need to mute your, you don't get feedback. Okay, okay, thank you. So I also wanted to extend a personal thank you to everyone who's joined us today in Taipei, as well as those online. The purpose of my presentation today is just to go over basically the findings of the report, to give some context and background for the discussion that will happen right after this with our expert panel. For those of you with us in Taipei, you'll have a copy of the report in front of you, and then we will also share the report online afterwards as well. So for those of you joining virtually who cannot view the report right now, we encourage you to go to our website after this to read it. So the purpose of this report, and I think Julie has already quite articulately gone through why we did this study, but the purpose of this research was to explore the role of international business associations, or IBAs, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic policies across the Indo-Pacific region. In particular, the unique though limited role they played in advocating for certain rights and civic freedoms during this time. We believe that sort of little research exists currently analyzing the policy objectives of IBAs. International business associations all have common interests, but are all run independently. And so for that reason, I think there's not a lot of analysis at the regional level or comparative analysis. So part of the reason why this study was done to fill that gap as well. So the time frame, just to give some context for the study, the time frame of the study was approximately March 2020, when the WHO first declared the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, to May 2023, when the WHO downgraded the pandemic as a global health emergency. Again, just for some background for the study, the methodology was done with interviews with association leaders across the region, an online survey with associations in the region, supported by secondary research. So the presentation today, first I will discuss a little bit about the advocacy governance structures of IBAs, and then address sort of the three principles that we found during our study, that is access to information, freedom of assembly, and equal treatment or non-discrimination. Those are the three principles that we found in our research that IBAs were particularly priority issues for IBAs as pertinent during the COVID-19 pandemic. As related to civic freedoms and certain rights advocacy. So just for a little bit of background on sort of governance structures of IBAs, to provide some context, all IBAs provide their services via one or more of the following channels: through advocacy to home or host governments, through networking opportunities, and by hosting events. And finally, by providing research or insights, and also just through general information sharing. What drives an IBA's advocacy governance structure can vary from association to association, but will always follow a consensus-driven approach. And so you'll see here, this is while some smaller IBAs may choose to have to only advocate on an issue once they have sort of close to unanimity among their members, others may have a 2-member minimum threshold before they decide to prioritize an issue for advocacy. And then others may just have a general consensus-driven approach. So once an issue is identified for advocacy, there's a consultation process with the home or host governments, depending on the issue. Finally, ideally, there will be policy outcomes that will inform the current policy or business environment, then leading back to driving members' business interests and so forth. So while the values of human rights or civic freedoms and the business interests of IBAs may seem to overlap in a limited way, our research does show that businesses and business associations can and do have an interest in advocating for certain rights and civic freedoms, and that there is a growing convergence of business interests in activities like CSR, ESG, socially responsibly investing, or SRI. In particular, as I mentioned earlier, we've identified 3 priority areas around rights advocacy during the COVID-19 pandemic. The first one is access to information. Under sort of the umbrella of access to information, the first principle that we identified, or first function rather, that we identified was information sharing. Some IBAs in the region played sort of more active roles in this sense, and others perhaps chose to act more passively. You might say just as platforms for information sharing, or kind of centralized hubs for conveying information. Many also chose to use their platforms as a means for translating regulations, general information, usually into English as sort of the lingua franca of the region, and for broader information sharing. Again, not only to members, but in some cases also just for the benefit of the broader public. Some would keep their information sort of behind kind of more closed doors. Others would be more willing to share it more broadly for the benefit of the broader public. AmCham Malaysia is a good example of this, but I will leave that to Siobhan to describe in more detail later about the work that her chamber did and how she pivoted her chamber during the pandemic in this sense. Many IBs also use their platforms to organize events which convened officials, business leaders, and other stakeholders to not only encourage access to information, but also to encourage discussion from the community. Digital access was also another important advocacy priority for some IBAs during the pandemic. For example, they advocated on behalf of industries or sectors or specific goods or services that fell outside of the exception to services exempt from lockdowns. In one case in Myanmar, for example, Eurocham Myanmar directly advocated to the government for lessening restrictions for access to SIM cards, which would have disproportionately affected vulnerable populations in the northern Rakhine and southern Chin states, where ongoing controversies around citizenship, statelessness, and availability of identity documents would have made it difficult or even prevented them from access to digital services. Finally, misinformation and disinformation was unfortunately a common problem across many areas of the pandemic and pandemic policies, especially around things like vaccines and other scientific or medical discoveries. So some chambers, such as Eurocham Singapore, directly tackled the problem by publishing a book titled, very straightforwardly titled, COVID Vaccination, Facts and Fiction. You can find that online if you're interested to look. It's on their website. Others, such as Eurocham Cambodia, were approached directly by other stakeholders, such as UNICEF, the WHO, and other partners to assist with dissemination of pandemic-related information. Next, freedom of movement, I think, was another principle that was especially relevant to the pandemic and a topic that was particular relevance to IBAs during the pandemic. But one of the questions that we asked during our survey was, both prior to and as a result of the pandemic, were travel restrictions and border controls for both people or goods a priority issue for your association? As you can see here, even prior to the pandemic, it was an important issue. 44% said that it was an issue for their association prior to the pandemic, but that number went up to 56%, who said that this became an important topic for their association as a result of the pandemic. So more than half. So when discussing freedom of movement during the pandemic, I think cross-border restrictions, whether from closed borders or onerous testing requirements or quarantine policies, significantly affected many businesses and individuals. And during the research, we documented cases of IBAs in Mongolia, China, Japan, where they advocated specifically for relaxed border restrictions, either to allow foreign workers to enter, local employees to return home, or simply the ease of movement of goods across borders. Another issue under the umbrella of freedom of movement is movement control orders, or MCOs. Prime problem with MCOs that we identified during our research was that many policies were characterized by blanket directives that did not accurately identify essential industries, sectors, or reasons, such as humanitarian appeals, as exceptions. And for many economies which rely on migrant workers, Singapore, for example, MCOs in some cases disproportionately affected such populations. And some IBAs we identified in our research, such as the AmChams in Taiwan and Singapore, did address these issues, especially in relation to migrant workers. Quarantine is probably almost synonymous with pandemic. So quarantine obviously was a very delicate balance of health priorities and civic freedoms. And we identified at least one instance where in AmCham Hong Kong, for example, they surveyed their members on the issue of forced quarantine of children who tested positive for COVID. They were forced to be sent to government-run quarantine centers, and in many cases separated from their parents or families. And while this may not, at first glance, may not seem to be directly related to the operations or direct interests of businesses or associations, member companies, it does speak to the political environment these member companies would be operating in. It speaks to the economies that they would be contributing to. And it also speaks to the concern that even employees or potential employees of those companies might have for their own families as well. So it is actually important, even if not directly related to a company's bottom line per se. Finally, we identified the concept of equal treatment or non-discrimination based on national origin as the third principle in our study. As a CEO, during one of our interviews, as a CEO of the European Chamber of Commerce in Taiwan put it so succinctly, and I just paraphrase here, the virus doesn't distinguish between a foreigner and a local. And that's sort of the driving principle behind the idea of non-discrimination based on national origin. There have been documented cases of testing requirements and access to vaccines that have differed between foreigners or even foreign businesses and nationals. And so there are instances that we found where many IBAs did advocate to their local governments for either testing requirements that did not disproportionately target foreigners or for expanded access to vaccines for foreigners, either for their foreign employees or just foreigners in general that were in the country. Finally, regarding relief assistance provided, which is provided by many governments during the pandemic around the world, but many IBAs we found advocated for better support for foreign residents or even foreign businesses on the premise of their role as taxpayers and also community contributors. So in conclusion, we did find that IBAs did advocate narrowly on certain human rights and civic freedoms in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. They emerged as force multipliers for civil society development. As Julie said earlier, IBAs have a unique nonpartisan position that allows them access and influence to many governments or in political situations that actors in civil society, for example, may not have, or other nonprofit organizations may not have. Therefore, one of the takeaways from this report is that we would encourage greater awareness and engagement between IBAs and actors like those in civil society in the future, as IBAs can be a practical, if not perhaps less well understood, but still practical platform for advancing the conversation on rights and civic freedoms. Finally, we have the link here if you'd like to view the report online or share the report. QR code here. We can also email the report afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Morgan. What we would like to do now is pivot over to Siobhan to share a case study about what your organization did during the pandemic. Siobhan, maybe just to kick off the question for you, really in early 2020, what kinds of initiatives or priorities did the Malaysian AmCham begin to focus on, and why?
Great. Thank you very much, Seth, and to Morgan for including AmCham here. I am going to ask you to allow me to share screen because I think you've disabled that on your system. So
okay, let me
lot to cover. So I thought I threw up a very packed PowerPoint so that I can remember to get through a lot of the stuff that we did. I think it was an unprecedented moment in the chamber's history, and I think an unprecedented in many ways on so many different things that we tried to achieve. So I'm going to take you through this very, very quick, well, as quickly as I can.
Right. Siobhan, I think you have screen sharing capabilities now. We made you a co-host.
Let me see if I can go there. Just give me 1 second while I attempt technology as well. Okay.
As you can see, it's been many years since the COVID pandemic has made us less adept at Zoom.
There you go. Great. So I'll try and get through this packed deck. I kind of threw everything. Not quite the kitchen sink is in there, but there's a lot in here because there was a lot that did happen, and a lot of that actually did touch on some of the areas that you mentioned here on civil society, but also on just the freedom of movement. And I think with the MCOs and the lockdowns that went in place very quickly in Malaysia, we really kind of had to pivot as to how are we going to help our members. At the time, we had about almost 300 member companies, and they represent a large force in a large part of the workforce in Malaysia. We're a small chamber in comparison to some of the chambers in the region, but we've got some very key sectors, and of course, the semiconductor sector was probably one of the most, I would say, one of the hardest hits because it wasn't declared an essential area immediately, and we managed to get to the business advocacy right up front to get that changed. And once that changed, in order for components to be accessible, to go into cars and to go into ventilators, into other healthcare equipment that the pandemic needed, that was a primacy. We're trying to get that through and get the global supply chains working so that the entire globe did not feel deprived of the components that needed to go into machines. So that was one of the big drivers. We have great members that support us. I just want to give a flash up there because without these members' support and the total 300 that we have, we wouldn't be where we are today and wouldn't be able to pivot. I'm just giving you this, just throwing this up here because it's all about people. It's all about what we can all do. Team AmCham 2020, 2021. These are the people that made it all happen. And I'm just very proud of it because they pivoted at the same time. It wasn't a directive. We all pivoted together. It wasn't something like, this is what we're going to do. Everybody just came and said, what do we try and how do we make our members' lives better, easier? And by virtue of that, how do we make Malaysia better? So some key achievements, and this was just coming in from about just the first few months kind of what AmCham did. We managed to get, as I mentioned earlier, approval for the electronics industry to operate. And that was really critical in order to get supply chains moving. And, we all kind of adopted not on my watch was we going to let supply chains break down. And through the subsequent MCOs, we managed to increase their level of operation from 50% to 70% and ultimately to 100%. And that meant movement of workers. That really was about movement of workers in and out of factories. We also had to work on immigration, the re-entry of expatriates. You mentioned about crossing borders. This is where we worked very closely with the government to have support letters, authorization letters made much simpler, much easier. The relaxation of the quarantine periods for professional visa classes, creating specialty kind of areas and specialty kind of lists for countries that were having much greater success in controlling the virus, so to speak. So we really worked hard with authorities to make sure that border control movements of people were as smooth as possible. Standing operating procedures, these were from day one our biggest, probably where we pivoted the most. The quick dissemination of translations and ironing out the confusions. Also resolutions on the distribution of personal information through the movement of control. We had a digital app called the My Sujatra app. Sorry, I misspelled it there, it's missing an H. But we really worked to try and make sure that businesses got back online as quickly as possible. And in order for that to happen, we really needed to have people back at work where they needed to be back at work, and the ones that could work from home, working from home. So as I mentioned, the biggest area that we worked on was to get information to everybody as quickly as possible. Our team, we were given standard operating positions that came to us in this format, but all in Bahasa. And what we realized is that our headquarters back in the US needed to understand this, and everybody needed to understand as quickly as possible so they could make decisions. And we started doing these translations unofficial. Obviously, everything was unofficial. But we were coordinated with the authorities that were producing them so that they understood what we were putting out, and we were checking, there was checks and balances to making sure that what we were putting out was accurate to what they were trying to express. And as they updated it, we would highlight the updates in yellow to make sure people very quickly could understand what was happening, where the updates were. And these were coming down probably 30 every day. I mean, there were like updates constantly. So there was a big flurry of it. Ultimately, we managed to get some support from other chambers, and so therefore BritChamp also walked in and helped us translate and support us, and that was really helpful to know there was another chamber supporting us doing these translations, because it was heavy lifting. And if I go back to that team of 10, there's probably only about 4 of us that were qualified to do the translations. And you know, these translations just kept coming. This started from day one on March 20th or March 18th, all the way through for the next kind of year and a half. And we needed to get that, and that was really, really important. So we wanted to make sure they were completely accessible. So we listed them up online. Everybody could get them, anybody who wanted them. And this actually, from what I understand, traveled around the world. So people who were interested in any interest in Malaysia managed to get that information as quickly as possible. They were listed in English version, the Bahasa version, so people could check themselves. They didn't need to be totally reliant on the English version, but they could go back to the original text and make sure that they could see what was going on. And also giving them a time list of when the SOPs were coming through as well. So it was all about communication. Our daily newsletters suddenly ramped up. We had, trying to bring the news and the information as quickly as possible to members. We used to put out as much as we could from what we gleaned from the government, gleaned from the public, but also if we had updates from our members, we would also include that. We created a whole new site that was dedicated just to the COVID updates. And that was really, really useful because people just could go in there and dive in and get the information that they needed as quickly as possible. We also understood that some of the hardest hit industries was the hospitality industry, and we had members either suspend their membership or quit altogether. But it didn't matter to us because we understood what they were going to. But what we ended up doing was taking a real effort to try and make sure that that industry stayed alive. And we created this newsletter that was specifically dedicated to this sector, irrespective of whether you were still a member or not, we still kept you on board and tried to keep their presence alive, even if they were on massive restrictions. And I think, going back and I look back at some of the stuff we did, very, very positive for the industry, and to try and keep them, at least their name in the papers, so to speak, and alive and fresh for people. As you could see, this was just in the first couple of months, massive increase in notifications on a daily basis to members. Really saw a surge there, and I think we're very proud of what we were able to do. We were in the news for all the right reasons, trying to make sure that we rallied members to help COVID, making sure that our membership was very aware of what was going on, and of course the advocacy. Highlights, I mean, there's so much to go in here, but basically making sure that our members could operate, and that meant the free flow of movement within workers, but also the safe free flow of freedom of movement. They had to be safe. We had to make sure that working with the government very closely, what that movement was, and how do we make it safe, and how do we adopt like a green kind of a traffic light process that a lot of the American companies and European companies were adopting internally. How do we help the government understand what those procedures were? And there was a lot of back and forth, but nonetheless, we were able to really kind of simplify the messaging and all of that. All of this was member driven. Through the subsequent MCOs, we used to touch base with our members to try and understand how they were responding to the restrictions that were on there. So we ran polls almost, I think they definitely hated me by the end of this year or so. We would have a constant poll going on, but it was good to be able to take a pulse of what's going on. How did you feel? Whether the government was handling it well? Generally positive. And of course, when we saw the negative, we just we managed to kind of understand what was the problem and try and address those areas. We also did a business impact study to try and understand exactly, dive deeper into what was going on with the movement controls, how people were moving it, what were the concerns, and how people were planning for the future, how were they planning to come out of it. And again, this is all happening very rapidly, and trying to get as much information to people as quickly as possible. We also created our own little tool to try and help the supply chain work better. We wanted to try and provide a green list of companies that were actually observing the SOPs very well. And we got 30 registered companies, member companies, put in there supporting supply chain people in their companies in there, and created a tool where we could actually try and help the government or help us monitor what was going on in the supply chain beyond our membership. We also then, I think the biggest area, and I'll try and wrap it up as quickly as possible, but basically the biggest area was what we did with My AmCham Cares, which was a pivot to, and this was happened from the Corporate Citizenship Committee, on how we're going to help members on the ground, but also the community. And what we had was members who had additional excess PPP because they were shut down. That's personal protective equipment. And so how could we get this as quickly as possible to the people that needed it? So staff started a Excel sheet, and this came out of our committee. They started putting this down just to track it. And then we decided to make it visible and open to our members. And if you can see here, we basically took what was available and tried to distribute it as quickly as possible to the needs of the community. And I think there were 49 companies that participated. We were able to get equipment to hospitals, clinics, and this was done very much in the early stages. And I think supported by and coordinated with the Ministry of Health. We didn't want to undermine what they were doing, but we were able to respond and get the equipment to the people as quickly as possible. And I think the ministry actually appreciated the fact that we were on the ground, being able to respond quickly while they were getting the juggernaut working. And I think that we didn't continue it for over the 3 years, but certainly in the first 6 months we were very present, and also addressing not just the hospitals, but also indigenous communities, refugees, stateless communities, wherever we could get the equipment that we could deploy. It was pretty hefty when we tallied it all up. It was pretty amazing. We're very proud of what we ended up doing, but we were able to get all this equipment to people. There was a massive amount of contribution. Some of it was in cash, but we really tried to do it mostly in kind. Most states were impacted. As I said, we would put AmCham labels on them just so that people could understand where it was coming from. And if you look at the amount of information and the amount of equipment that was donated, it was quite significant. And we're very proud of the work that we have managed to do to impact the community. And these, very proud of our members that coming together, we were able to do that. So, just in conclusion, we really wanted to kind of try and find a way to take the businesses directly into the communities. And we were able to pivot only because our members cared and came to us to say, how do we do this? And, I just want to say, as support, just remember to join the chamber and support your chamber, because at the end of the day, it's coming together that really matters. So with that, I will stop sharing and hand it over back to you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Siobhan. We really appreciate hearing this story about how your Chamber of Commerce was able to pivot into the public interest over those years. So let me just pivot over to our panelists here. We've got 3 panelists representing 3 different angles here. Ultimately, the paper is about the relationship between really bridging commerce and rights advocacy during the pandemic. But I want to step back away from the pandemic per se and begin to ask a question more about the trends that we're seeing over time and what we hope to see moving into the future, particularly as we find that there are more and more crises occurring, whether environmental or political, security. And so I believe asking these questions about what businesses and civil society can do to work together are very important. Steve, why don't I ask you the first question from our panel? You've got a background in government. Then you've worked in-house for a company in their corporate affairs and their government affairs. Over the last few decades, many, many years, you've been advising companies on their corporate citizenship, their CSR, their ESG, their sustainability. Over your career, what, particularly in the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific region, what are the trends that you've seen in terms of the posture or the attitude of companies towards rights advocacy, towards CSR, towards this area of public interest?
Well, I would say, I used to describe my career, Seth, as being, at the intersection of business and government. And now I describe it as being at the collision of business and government. And so given where we are and how much tension and conflict there can be, in addition to cooperation that you find between business and government, you have to take a different approach as a business. And the role that associations can play in particular is even more important now, because all the illustration and Morgan gave some great examples and Siobhan gave a deep dive. During a crisis, the businesses had to focus on how do we just keep operating day to day? How are we going to make sure that we make enough money to stay in business, to pay our people, to pay our bills, and be able just to survive? And so your focus becomes solely on that. The association takes on a different role. It takes on a role of advocating for the employees of the companies more so than it normally would, because the business isn't focusing on that, and nor should it have been. And then it also focuses on civil society, and you see those types of backlashes that can occur. And an example, Morgan gave that example about migrant workers in Singapore and how that got lost from a business perspective, but the business associations knew this was something that we needed to talk about and that we could talk about it. And I think in that going forward perspective, when we talk about that collision of business and government, one of those things where that's really happening is human rights, and especially in Southeast Asia. because when you have so many migrant workers as we do in Southeast Asia, in not only that, I mean, you have it in Singapore, you certainly have it in Malaysia and in Indonesia, in Thailand. That's where you have the greatest chance for abuse of those workers. And it's not something that businesses have a necessary expertise on. So working with associations, working with NGOs becomes more important, because if you don't protect those human rights, you can lose access to the market. The US has shut down access to companies because of forced labor out of Xinjiang, because of forced labor in Malaysia, because of forced labor in Indonesia. And having that collision of business and government and associations being able to pick up on where businesses don't have expertise is going to become more critical going forward. And hopefully it's not because we have another pandemic, because then it'll be there whether we have one or not.
Thanks a lot, Steve. I'd like to pivot to Elena and ask a question for Elena about the role that your company plays in helping businesses do their due diligence reporting, whether it's on human rights or environment. Perhaps you could even explain a little bit about what Labor Solutions does, because this is really where the rubber hits the road on this issue. And perhaps you can explain to us a little bit about what's driving some of your clients and customers coming to you needing help on their due diligence.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I mean, I actually want to speak a little bit about what Steve said and kind of play on that a bit, because I think what's happening increasingly post-COVID is we're seeing more and more regulations come out globally, not just in Europe, but also in the US last week. The president's office came out with a national action plan on responsible business conduct. And it has an enormous number of due diligence and responsible sourcing requirements, right? Essentially what the US and Europe are saying today is you are responsible for any harm done to humans or the environment in the production of your good, whatever that good may be, right? And that could be just the transportation of your good, that could, the whole value chain, right? From the minerals that are used to the people who package and deliver your good. And that task is, for a lot of companies, overwhelmingly huge, right? It is so big, particularly for some fast-moving consumer goods who have tons and tons of different types of goods that they have, right? And they have different ingredients, and their supply chains are super complex. And so what really this is kind of calling for, and I hope to see comes out of these laws, is more local government action. So for example, Indonesia does not have a national grievance hotline. So if a worker is abused at work, no matter where they're abused at work, there's nobody to hold them accountable, right? There's no government organization or specific process to enable them to call and report that abuse. Well, the US and the EU are now saying that if workers don't have access to grievance mechanisms, then then we can't say that those workers are safe, right? We can't say that no harm has been done to those workers. And so a really great place for chambers of commerce to come in, or industry groups, is to do some of these things that really should be done at a national level, like grievance mechanisms, like training, post-departure training before you go and you become a migrant worker in another country. There's little things that need to be done to help companies be able to continue to source from these countries that are critical to their supply chains. I think if we look at Indonesia and its potential, it's insane, right? Like Indonesia is the next center of supply chain for batteries, right? Battery production. You know, we see Indonesia has the second largest producer of cobalt in the world, right? We know that cobalt is an essential ingredient to batteries, and Indonesia has nickel, et cetera, et cetera. But right now, Indonesia cannot export any of those minerals to US companies that are producing batteries because Indonesia has not done some of the basic human rights things that the US government is looking for. And so we need to see chambers of commerce really use these powers to influence government to say, hey, this is good for both, Indonesia or Cambodia and the US, right? This is good for the people, for workers, and for big companies. We really need to get these big systematic laws and systems put in place in order to meet these regulations that are coming full steam ahead. That didn't really answer your question, but I thought but I'll also play to that unless you want to move on. I know I took up some time there. We essentially help, I mean, Labor Solutions quickly, we help big consumer brands like the Nikes, Adidas, Apples of the world better understand their supply chains and their value chains, and help them reduce, mitigate, prevent, and identify forced labor or other human rights abuses within the supply chains. Sorry, back to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Siobhan. Elena, it looks like Siobhan, we've got a question from you. Please feel free to ask.
Not so much a question as I just wanted to kind of comment on what Elena and Steve said just now. But I think what we learned was about just exactly what role we can actually play in that discussion. And while we may not necessarily be able to change it overnight, we were certainly shown pathways of where we could actually have the conversations, where we could actually interject, and where we could inject ideas of what they need to do. And I say this because even in the vaccination program, we were vaccinating everybody who was in Malaysia. It wasn't whether you're a citizen or not a citizen. You were there, you were in Malaysia. The government recognized that it wasn't about vaccinating citizens only. It was vaccinating anybody who was there. So that included the migrant labor population. That also included the undocumented population, because those is how do you make sure they were scared to come out for all the reasons they were undocumented. So how do you get that? So we had to work with them to try and understand how do we actually get that information to them so that they could feel safe enough to come out and get vaccinated. And then going forward, how do we use the same sort of ideas to talk to them about what Lena mentioned about regulations that are coming down that will impact businesses, will impact the validity of your product at the global level. And how do we do that? And how do we have the conversations? And how do we help them understand how to move in that space? And I think that is very valid as a pathway that we can work towards.
Thanks a lot.
I just have one quick thing, Seth. Just
yes.
Go faster. But part of why you join association is to protect the brand, right? You don't, as a business, you don't necessarily want to be out there publicly and sometimes even privately, being aggressive against the host government which you're at. That's not what you should be doing, and that's not the only role of the association, but that can be a very valuable role of an association. And where associations can come in, especially on human rights, is have the difficult discussion saying we're here representing all of our members, and we want to work with you, foreign government, to address these issues. And Malaysia has been a great case where the Malaysian government has worked with the US government, has worked with AmCham in Malaysia, has worked with NGOs to address issues. They still got a long way to go, but it's really a good case study of what where an association fits in on these types of difficult discussions.
Thanks, Steve. We have Sean Shea here in the room. Sean, from the perspective of civil society, and in particular in the Asia Pacific region, what would you say, or how could you characterize civil society's posture towards business? And has that relationship changed over the years or over the decades? Let's say going from just purely grant taking from a corporate foundation, or do you see more collaboration in terms of what we're talking about now?
Yeah, right. Thanks for that question. So I think there's a wide range of responses when it comes to civil society engaging with businesses. I think some are more, there is collaboration between civil society and business on some areas, but I think in terms of like rights advocacy, there tends to be more skepticism, especially on the part of labor organizations, on the part of environmental organizations that maybe will not take corporate money, because they see it as a conflict of interest. So I think there is. We often talk about maybe business and civil society, or business and NGOs don't really like oil and water. They're quite mixed, right? So But I think there is potential. I mean, and as Elena mentioned, there's a lot of like, I think, growing pressure on companies to comply with human rights due diligence and environmental due diligence, especially in the EU. But that conversation and that movement is also generating more conversation in the Asia Pacific about what governments and civil society here can do to also comply with those kinds of that kind of legislation that is coming from the EU. And I think that in East Asia, we're beginning to see more of that. We're beginning to see more civil society organizations coming together to talk about the need for business and human rights focus. And governments in East Asia do have like national action plans that they've drawn up on business and human rights. But I think the problem is implementation, and trying to get them to move on this. And I think here it would be good to see more collaboration between business associations and civil society. I think there is some meeting of the minds between these two groups, but we've been trying to help some civil society groups here in Taiwan who see that there's an opportunity for them to do some consulting with businesses on these issues. The problem, I think, is that business associations tend to outsource this kind of work, not to NGOs, not to these kinds of rights-based NGOs, but they outsource it to like big consulting companies who do that work. So there doesn't seem to be that kind of collaboration that is going on that I would like to see.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Actually, this is my last question for the panel here as we wrap up, which is, what do we want to see? How do we think that civil society and businesses can work better together moving forward? And what role does the association play? So really looking to the future, what do we see? And I think you actually had a call to action here, which is make sure that businesses are working with some of these rights promoting organizations at the civil society level, rather than necessarily outsourcing it to the big four, these guys who do a lot of that work. But any other thoughts, Steve or Elena, in terms of what can civil society and business do better in the Indo-Pacific moving forward? Or if you were to take out your crystal ball, do we see that?
I'll go first, Seth. I'll go.
Too bad.
Sure. I mean, look, when I was certainly in-house or working with companies in-house, the question is, you want to find somebody who's going to partner with you, who is going to help you on your journey to address your ESG issues, and certainly in this case, the human rights in your supply chain issue. So who is it that is going to look at you as a partner and have a way to address those concerns, recognizing this is a journey, it is going to take time, you want to get to the right place, and you need to do so from a business approach. Those are the partners you work with. There are other groups in civil societies who do a great job, who take a very different approach, and they will go to the government and they will say, hey, there is this forced labor going on at a PPE factory in Malaysia. US, you need to come in and shut them down. And there's a room for them too. But if you're talking from a business perspective, is who is it that you can partner with from a civil society perspective to help you become a better business? And that's who you're going to work with as a business. And that's not to say that there's not room for other approaches as well. But that's from the business and the association perspective of who you partner with.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Elena, you just shared a great link here. We'll share it for everybody here in the room as well. That's the Responsible Business Conduct National Action Plan. But addressing the future orientation of this question, what do you see specifically in the Asia-Pacific region? Do you have any recommendations out there for associations and the role that they can play, either as a force multiplier or as a convener?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of echoing some of the other things that have been said, is there are things that that need to be done at a national level, right? Like when you look at for example, the National Action Plan I just sent, or some of the EU directives on human rights due diligence, right? there are some things that are very company specific, right? This company needs to do these things. This company needs to have its own legal process or a specific site. But there are a lot of things that need to be done effectively, need to be done at a national level. And they need to be done through a consortium of business, civil society, and government, right? It can't be done in a silo. It will not work if only government does it, if only civil society does it, right? Or if only business does it. And so I think really looking at these new directives and laws and thinking about how can each one of these Chamber of Commerce, how can they best contribute to helping businesses, whether they be US businesses or European business or whatever they may be, who are looking to source from these countries or are looking to export from these countries, how can they help move the needle so that they're in compliance? And it can be very small things and it can be bigger things, right? But I think it's really trying to decide what is more effective that we do as a group versus what are we like piecemeal doing one by one. And I think, I said this earlier, grievance lines are one of those things where third-party grievance lines are required by almost all of these directives. And most of Southeast Asia doesn't have countrywide grievance lines. And as a result, we see multinational companies, based in Amsterdam or New York, who are setting up third-party helplines in random factories and farms and plantations around countries, random countries, and they're not effective, right? It doesn't actually help a worker. A worker doesn't get anything from that. They don't know who they're talking to. The company has no real actual responsibility to that, right? If they don't source from that place anymore. And it's really duplicitous. We're seeing lots of duplication, right? Every company is doing this. And so this is something that really should be done on a country level, really should be done as a collective, right? And that's just one little example, right? There's tons of other things within these directives that can be done at a country level or can be done at an association level. But I think that, the US and the EU are being very clear about what their expectations are when it comes to human rights and what needs to be done.
Just want to add to that, Seth.
Sure.
Where the chambers and the industry associations, because it's not just limited to chambers, can help is also to start building that trust. That civil, you see, there was a disconnect between what civil societies, organizations, chambers, and business and it's to start building that level of trust, understanding what the needs are of the CSOs, understanding the needs of the businesses, and understanding the needs of the government as well. And how do you start talking to each other and with each other so that you're not trying to, I think sometimes the companies go to the consultants because they need protection of the brand. So if there's another way of coming together where they, under the collective, where they can talk about things that are not necessarily going to hit the press tomorrow, and you're not being asked by an organization, a civil society organization, to change the world tomorrow or today. It's how do we get onto the bus together? How do we get on the move, get on a journey, as you said earlier? How do we do this together and build that trust as to what we can achieve versus what our ultimate goals are, and how do we move them? Because we need to bring them together. And I think that's where the role of the association and other chambers can start playing that role and be effective, as what Elena was talking about.
Thanks, Siobhan. I think, Sean, you had a comment?
Yeah, I agree with what Elena said about collaboration, and that's essential, especially when we talk about the pandemic. So my report was all about collaborative governance. I mean, how do you create that whole society approach, which is very difficult, but I think especially necessary when you're facing something like a pandemic. And then to Siobhan's point, I think that part about what we need is more trusted bridges between the business community and the civil society community, to bring them together that can be trusted. I think international business associations play an important role here. I know that here in Taiwan, I know AmCham in Taiwan has been really important in terms of introducing, connecting CSOs and businesses. So I think that's important. I think we can also start from the point of values. I mean, I think recognizing that, what this report does is it kind of raises awareness about the importance of certain human rights values. So like access to information, transparency, freedom of movement, and equal treatment. I mean, these are all important human rights principles that I think we can all start with and hopefully agree on and move forward from there.
So I think there's just one little thing that I would add to this all, which is to say, one of the things that we've seen happen since since the passing of these new regulations is that companies are really scared now, right? Because we know for a fact that human rights abuses are happening within almost all global company supply chains. We know that, like, it's a fact, right? And so they're really scared to share, and they're really scared to come forward because they don't want to be sued, because now there's laws that will hold them accountable. And so this is where Chamber of Commerce come into play, right? You don't have to have one company sticking their neck out, right? You saying we are representing the interest of all international companies or all American or whatever companies. And that really helps give cover to these companies to actually get the work they need to get done, right? Without feeling like they're exposing themselves.
Absolutely. And you know, we work with our other chambers here. So the German Chamber, the European Chamber, and bring that collective. So it's not necessarily just focused on the Americans, but so we try and bring everybody together and see whether that natural, how does it work in Malaysia? And I think that's what we can do.
Great. Well, I do know that we've run over time. Certainly, if anyone has any questions for the panelists, do send that along. We will circulate a link to the report. We'll also send a link to Sean's report that he did under this umbrella study as well, focused on Taiwan. And Julie wanted to mention that ICNL would be happy to carry on some of these conversations between IBAs and civil society going forward. So feel free to, we'll circulate Julie's email, Julie Hunter, jhunter@icnl.org. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody who came here in Taipei in person. Thank you for coming down to our offices. Thank you everyone who joined us online. We really appreciate it. And in particular, we'd really like to thank the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law and Julie for your support in getting this project off the ground, and everybody that contributed their time with interviews and doing surveys. And we certainly hope to circulate this around to all the AmChams, EuroChams, and other chambers of commerce doing international business. And hopefully we can get these conversations started elsewhere. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice morning.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.